Hello everyone, and welcome to the final mini lecture of our unit on drug abuse and addiction. Is addiction a disease? So I'll start off by saying that you all probably know my perspective on this. I tend to prescribe to the medical model, and I do see addiction as a disease state. That said, I'm going to move through how the book talks about it. Here we go. So the medical model is basically just the idea of viewing addiction as a disease rather than a moral failing, which we call the moral model. You see a lot of this, and you might hear a lot of people talk about things as a moral failing, like addicts are to blame for their state because they have failed morally, they've succumbed to drug use and abuse, and they should just stop doing it, and it's their fault. So I feel that the moral model isn't very helpful. It might make you feel good if you are someone who is not a drug addict, and to sort of put people in a place like that, but it's not really very useful. The nice thing about the medical model is it does take into account everything that we've discussed so far, especially all the neurobiological stuff, neuroadaptation, things like tolerance and withdrawal, the cycle of addiction, and how those aspects fit in with that cycle, and even concepts of things like incentive salience that can drive relapse. Something else that the medical model accomplishes is it can sort of reduce the sense of guilt in recovering addicts. Oftentimes, people who are recovering from addiction feel intensely guilty about what they've done or the way that they've spent their time as an addict. However, some people even see this as a negative aspect, right? That relieving the guilt of people who have suffered from a substance use disorder is not a good thing. Many people who have recovered have cited feelings of responsibility for themselves and self-efficacy, and feeling bad about the state they were in is the reason why they pulled themselves out. So I guess that's sort of a debatable point, whether or not removing a sense of guilt is a good thing or not. I guess it depends on the individual. So some criticisms of the medical model are that, well, there's the claim that drugs of abuse alter the brain, but so do many experiences, right? Remember we talked about things like LTP, where whenever you learn anything, you alter your brain, right? You create new connections, you strengthen connections that already exist, and real plastic changes take place in real time. But many would argue on top of that that the brain changes that take place in an addiction state are pathological, thus constituting a disease state. So the more than simple routine changes that happen in the brain every day, these are pathological changes that are extremely debilitating. Another criticism might be that addiction can only be diagnosed based on symptoms. There's not a lab test that can identify why you are an addict, right? It's not like a test for diabetes or something where you can see exactly what's gone wrong and why someone has a disease. It's more ephemeral than that. But it's much like other psychiatric disorders in that way. There's not a lab test for depression, but it's still a real thing that we treat seriously. Addiction doesn't have the same sort of hard cause as something like diabetes. Just because we can't detect it with a lab test doesn't mean that it's not a real thing. Many people do recover without treatment, and there's some evidence that your book discusses that addicts can cognitively control their cravings when prompted to do so. And this sort of raises the question, is use really outside the control of the user? And that's, kind of a nebulous question, right? What does it mean to be able to control your cravings? Is it possible for someone to really, really lock down what they're feeling? Is it a matter of motivation? It's kind of uncertain. A common criticism that you see a lot more recently is that addicts choose drugs initially for a purpose, possibly to alleviate boredom or for lack of a better thing to do, really, or because other reinforcers are lacking. So the medical model might not really take that into account. And something that you sort of hear with this is often that if the other reinforcers in an environment were able to compete better, or the addict had better access to these positive reinforcers that were not drugs, you might see a decrease in drug use. The medical model tends to ignore other factors that we've discussed, like psychosocial roots, the groups people are part of, their socioeconomic status, what they have access to. A really, really great and sort of famous example of this is the rat park experiments done in the 70s. To briefly summarize this, extremely superficially, rats are basically either kept in standard laboratory housing where they don't have much to do, or they were kept in a large, enriched environment where they had access to a lot of stuff to play with and do, They had access to other rats. They could be social. They could run on a running wheel. They could exercise. They could do all kinds of things. What they found was that rats who had access to the rat park were much less likely to self-administer drugs and become addicted. However, those rats that are housed individually in boring standard laboratory type caging are much more likely to abuse drugs. The thought being because there's nothing else to do. If you lived in a cage all the time and had no access to anything, you would do drugs too, because that would be at least something. And people have tried to generalize this to sort of poor environments where people don't have access to things like after school programs or community centers or anything to do. Drugs are, of course, a appealing option when your life is pretty bleak and there's not much to do. So while people might not live in a cage, there's a sort of metaphorical cage of less good access to other competing reinforcers. This idea has gotten a lot of attention and has drawn some criticism for being sort of a wide generalization, but it is an interesting way to think about things nonetheless. But regardless, this line of thought sort of ends in the suggestion that treatments might be better serving the population if they move away, if they sort of move behavior from drug use toward more healthy and non-harmful reinforcers. Okay, so that wraps up our drugs and addiction unit. I hope you enjoyed our little mini lecture series, and I will see you all next time.